Hello, everyone, and welcome back after our break. This morning's sessions were so interesting and so fantastic. Thanks again to Shelley and to Jonathan for all of your organization. It's been wonderful. So my name is Jane Dryden. I'm a philosophy professor at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada. I have an interest in history of philosophy and as well in philosophy of disability. And I'm really interested in the kind of ways in which our ideas of the normal and the autonomous have developed in very strange and often ableist ways. So I'm very happy to be here today. I'm also very excited to introduce Dr. Christine Overall, who's going to be speaking on, as you can see on the slide, ageism, ableism, and the power of the double bind. Christine Overall is Professor Emerita of Philosophy and holds a university research chair at Queen's University, also in Canada. She was the first feminist philosopher elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 1998 and was the 2008 winner of the Royal Society of Canada's Gender Studies Award. Her 2003 book, Aging, Death, and Human Longevity, A Philosophical Inquiry, won both the Canadian Philosophical Association's Book Prize in 2005 and the Royal Society of Canada's Abby Ann Lynch Medal in Bioethics in 2006. She's published over 100 journal articles and book chapters in the areas of feminist philosophy, bioethics, and philosophy of religion. She's the author of 6 books and the editor of co-editor of 5. The most recent is Pets and People, The Ethics of Our Relationship with Companion Animals. So an incredibly accomplished scholar. And also, possibly relevant to this talk, she is the mother of 2 children and grandmother of 4. I just want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions in the chat at the bottom of the screen. Also at the bottom of the screen, you can see the button for closed caption options. So I think that's everything. Take it away, Christine. Thanks so much. I'm just going to turn off my video.
Thank you very much, Jane. And I want to say thank you very much to the organizers of this very stimulating conference. I'm honored and delighted to be included in it. I'm especially grateful to Shelley Tremaine, who's been a wonderful source of support and inspiration to me in the writing of my paper. I've learned a great deal from reading Shelley's work, though of course any weaknesses in this paper are entirely my own. Discussions of the moral and political significance of age, of the ethical and social policy aspects of ageism, and of the connections between ageism and ableism are shockingly rare in the discipline of mainstream philosophy. As Joel Michael Reynolds remarks, in philosophical research more generally, there has been relatively little work on aging and even less on disability and aging. Indeed, in the Philosopher's Index, there are only 35 entries under ageism, and only 2 of them involve a direct link to disability. The philpapers.org site purports to have 72 citations, but many are listed twice. And notably, some of these papers are defenses of ageism. Just 3 of the papers purport to be about ageism and disability. This paper is a small effort to partly fill in this regrettable lacuna in the philosophical literature. For all the current cultural fables about the joys of getting older, it is evident that aging is still made into a social liability. And this social liability sets in early. By aging and old, being old, I just mean living past the age of, let's say, 59. That is, in European and North American societies, to be old is to be aged 60 or more. One could quarrel with where I've placed it. Why not 65 or 69? But the fact is that being considered old still sets in fairly early. Indeed, the younger a person is, the earlier they think oldness arrives. And the social response to COVID-19 has certainly made age 60 especially salient. Ageism is not merely, ageism is not merely bias, marginalization, and/or mistreatment targeted at individuals or groups of individuals on the basis of their years lived or perceived years lived. Ageism is a system of oppression comprised of social practices and institutions that identify and constitute having lived longer than 60 or 65 as individual and social problems. For purposes of my paper, I will give a partial definition of being disabled as follows. Sorry, Jane, could you just mute your microphone? Thank you. To be disabled is to be perceived and treated as having a physical, psychological, or cognitive feature, set of features, or condition that is valued negatively as varying from the supposed human norm, as being incomplete, abnormal, dysfunctional, or defective. We all know what that norm is: a body that is white, slim, often athletic, belonging to a person with a particular kind of cognitive or psychological functioning, and who is heterosexual, gender sex congruent, middle or owning class, and above all, young. Though perhaps not too young. Culturally speaking, neither a 1-year-old nor a 12-year-old constitutes the norm. This feature or set of features or condition, like all features and conditions of human beings, may or may not have been caused by other human beings or social institutions. It may or may not involve pain or suffering to the individual herself, and it may or may not be valued negatively by the individual herself. Indeed, the individual may or may not actually possess the feature or set of features or condition that is valued negatively as varying from the supposed human norm. In what follows, I argue for two main claims. First, that ageism is disabling. And second, that one major mechanism by which ageism disables is by means of double binds, which carry unavoidable penalties and which negate the very personhood of the individuals at whom they are targeted. In terms of my own authority to talk about these issues, let me just say that I am indisputably old and that I have been seriously disabled at several points throughout my life, though I have often been expected to pass for normal. To remark that older people and people with labeled disabilities may often be treated similarly, with disrespect, marginalization, isolation, denial of autonomy, physical and psychological violence, in other words, with ageism and ableism, is not new. People who are labeled disabled and people considered old may similarly be considered expendable. But to me, the relationship between ableism and ageism is more complex than just similarity. In one of the few philosophical papers that explore the relationship between aging and disabilities, Reynolds refers repeatedly to the supposed phenomenon of becoming disabled through aging, or becoming less able due to aging. But I think the idea that we become disabled simply by virtue of getting older assumes that there is something biologically inherent within living longer that inevitably causes a supposed deterioration in capacities. This assumption makes aging and being disabled merely a matter of one's innate, supposedly non-social biology. This view fails to consider the social context in which human beings age. Instead, I suggest that the ageist conditions of aging, the material, cultural, psychological, and social environments in which people grow old are disabling. Ageism is disabling in two ways. The first way involves categorizing old people as disabled. Thanks to ageism, various features or conditions, often but not always possessed by aging people, or thought to be possessed by us, including but not limited to such features and conditions as gray hair, lined skin, a particular pace of movement, a particular way of speaking, a particular posture, balance, or sight or hearing, are perceived and treated negatively as varying from the supposed human norm, as being incomplete, abnormal, dysfunctional, or defective. To be old is automatically to be perceived and treated as being in a state of decline and deterioration. But ageism does not only contribute to the perception of aging persons as belonging to the category of disabled persons. Even more important, ageist circumstances and institutions can cause aging persons to acquire features or conditions that are seen as varying negatively from the norm, hence that become and are considered to be disabilities, and that often in addition involve unnecessary pain and suffering to the individuals who acquire them. The stereotypical features of aging that I just listed are not necessarily the inevitable expressions of some sort of innate natural evolution. Many of them are acquired or acquired sooner or acquired with more pain and suffering as a result of living in an ageist society. As Ashton Applewhite points out, the social conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic have not necessarily made ageism worse. Instead, they are exposing what's been all around all along. Nonetheless, the current ageist social response to the coronavirus pandemic disables huge swaths of the older population, who find their freedom and mobility limited and their well-being and lives threatened by the behavior of other people. Since the start of the pandemic, the treatment of people who have lived 60 years or more has been seriously, sometimes fatally, disabling. To take a particularly egregious example, consider Alessandro and Adelina Bussato. Aged 92 and 88 respectively, before the pandemic, they had active, autonomous, and social lives at their retirement home. But thanks to the ageist isolation, neglect, separation from family and from each other, and even abuse they experienced during the lockdown, their health has deteriorated so dramatically they need round-the-clock care. Their ordeal included infections, broken bones, and cognitive changes as a result of the isolation. When reunited with his spouse of 64 years, Mr. Bussato no longer recognized her. It is predicted that neither one will regain their ability to walk. Thus, ageism disabled them. As Margaret Morgenroth Gullett stresses, quote, "Being older is not by itself a death sentence from the virus. Some who survive are over 65, even over 100, the super survivors, like Sylvia Goldschall, who also survived the 1918 flu. People over 65 are not a group doomed to die by our physiology," end of quote. Nonetheless, the logical outcome of disablement through ageism is to make old people disappear through a willingness to allow or even encourage us to die. In a presentation I gave in the before times, back in May 2019, with the title, "Is Aging Good?" I said, If we're convinced that old age is as bad as the stereotypes suggest, then the Orwellian response would be to try to reduce the number of old people. The methods would include everything from reducing the quality and availability of healthcare, nursing care, housing, and nutrition, to actively encouraging old people to end their lives. That's what I said then, pre-pandemic. Little did I know then that less than a year later, a version of what I regarded as the Orwellian response to the supposed burden of old people would unfold via the pretext of the virus. Well before 2020, this idea was already a thread in public and academic discourse. For example, in John Hardwick's idea that old people have a duty to die when or even before they become a burden. But the pandemic has made it even more explicit. For example, Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, infamously advocated that senior citizens should be willing to die for the sake of the preservation of the American economy. Toby Young, a British right-wing columnist, argued at the beginning of the pandemic lockdown that, quote, spending £350 billion to prolong the lives of a few 100,000 mostly elderly people is an irresponsible use of taxpayers' money, end of quote. Among academics, this idea is also not uncommon. It has been suggested that the use of triage in apportioning pandemic healthcare could mean that age is used as an accepted criterion for decisions about who lives and who dies in the pandemic. In short, sacrifice the older person. He has already lived his life. More than one commentator has pointed out that this cavalier approach is a new form of eugenics, assessing old people on their supposed value and capacity to be productive. Being old, that is, having lived a certain number of years, whether it's 90, 80, 70, or 60, is the flaw itself, the fatal characteristic that makes us destined for death, and moreover, responsible for our deaths. So I'm going to turn now to the second major part of my paper to discuss how ageism disables via the use of double binds. Almost 40 years ago, feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye wrote, quote, one of the most characteristic and ubiquitous features of the world as experienced by oppressed people is the double bind, situations in which options are reduced to a very few and all of them expose one to penalty, censure, or deprivation, end of quote. To be trapped in a double bind is to be, according to Frye, caught between systematically related pressures. In the sense in which I am using the term, a double bind is a forced choice between alternatives, all of which carry heavy penalties. In the case of ageism, and perhaps in other forms of oppression, though I make no larger claims, double binds are rarely presented explicitly as such. That is, targets of the double bind are not explicitly told that they have only two options and that each of their options results in a penalty. Rather, messages about the options come to the individual under various and different circumstances in such a way that the targets are less likely to be able to notice and understand their relatedness. The communication of double binds to people who are older is ubiquitous and repeated. In some cases, such communications may even seem innocuous or well-intentioned in themselves. Hence, the situation for the aging person is likely mystified and mystifying. This fact makes it difficult or impossible for the targets to accurately identify the ageist environment and escape from it. This situation is the exemplification of Frye's classic birdcage analogy for oppression. in which, as Fry says, each individual wire by itself seems not to limit the bird, but together, as a network of systematically related barriers, they make escape impossible. Being in a double bind means a person cannot win whatever choice she makes or however she chooses to act. But double binds have an even more insidious and pernicious consequence. Being the target of a double bind means one cannot fully exist, since either choice negates who one is. One cannot be a full person with agency and intrinsic value because the double bind denies them. An effective double bind makes its target into a non-person. Hence, while the crudest form of disablement by ageism facilitates the physical death of old persons, as I argued previously, ageist double binds disable by facilitating the non-existence of old individuals as persons. In some ageist double binds, both alternatives are ostensibly positive. In some, one alternative is ostensibly positive and one is negative. And in others, both alternatives are clearly negative. But in all of them, the choices always produce penalties. Here's an example where the alternatives are both ostensibly positive. On the one hand, targets of ageism are commonly told that old people are privileged to enjoy their leisurely golden years without any cares and no longer have to contribute to the society in which they live. On the other hand, targets of ageism are told that we can and should continue to contribute to society by doing volunteer work, by caring for grandchildren or vulnerable relatives or strangers, and by our supposed wisdom and insight. The penalty for accepting the first message is twofold. It means acquiescing in a description that disparages the value of the target's lives if they fail to be of service to others. And it also ignores all those who are not benefiting from a financially secure and leisurely old age. It literally assumes they do not exist. The penalty for accepting the second message is that it sets very high standards for being personally valuable. The old person must be active, giving, contributing, wise. Meeting these standards can be difficult, painful, or even impossible. The individual is disabled by this double bind because one choice consigns her to the category of parasite, and the other choice exacts more than most people can do on an ongoing basis. Whichever choice the individual makes, she suffers an ageist penalty and the undermining of the value of her own unique existence. In other words, neither choice is existentially tenable. Some ageist double binds carry a mix of apparently positive and clearly negative messages. Consider, for example, the often heard compliment to people over 60 that they don't look their age, that they are not really old, that they could easily be taken for someone younger. This seems, and is often intended, to be a compliment. We are exhorted to engage in youthful activities and take on youth-associated values. Targets who fail to act and to present themselves as socially young are subjected to overt ageism, including questions about their so-called entitlements, complaints about their present or future burdensomeness, and lack of the kind of respect and autonomy granted to younger people. So the old individual has the seeming choice of, on the one hand, endeavoring to pass as young and accepting the idea that failing to look and act youthful is bad, or, on the other hand, refusing to try to pass as young and accepting the ageism that goes along with it. The double bind negates her existence because she either must pass as what she is not, a conventionally younger person, or she must accept a view of herself as burdensome and undeserving of respect. In my final example of a double bind, both alternatives are unambiguously negative. On the one hand, people who are still engaged in paid work past the age of 60 or 65 are often told that they are past their prime, that they are selfishly withholding jobs from young people, and that they should consider retiring. On the other hand, old people who are not engaged in paid work are told that they are a liability, a drag on the social support system, living off state pensions. It's obvious that both of these two alternatives are punitive. But note also that each so-called choice, working or not working, is stigmatized in such a way that it negates who the person is, a person of value with goals and needs and abilities of her own. The old individual is disabled by taking away her personhood. In this paper, I have defended two main claims. The first claim is that ageism is disabling, and that it disables in two ways. First, by categorizing old people as inevitably and inherently disabled, and second, by causing aging persons to acquire features or conditions that are seen and treated as varying negatively from the norm. The ultimate expression of disablement by aging is precipitating the physical death of the old person. My second claim is that a major mechanism by which ageism disables is by means of the imposition of double binds, which always carry unavoidable penalties and which disable by negating the very personhood of the individuals at whom they are targeted. While I do not offer any general solutions to these ageist forms of oppression, I believe it may at least be useful to identify more clearly the specific mechanisms by which ageism operates through its connections to ableism. And this is just a list of the various references that I used in the presentation of this paper. I want to thank you all very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Christine. We have some questions already. So the first one, would you say that the ageism is disabling argument only holds in ageist societies? So in other words, in your theory, would old people still be seen as disabled in societies or cultures that value filial piety?
Okay, I can't see the questions, so I just have to follow them from listening to you, Jane.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, okay, there. I don't know whether I can see them.
If you pull up the chat.
Got it. Yes, found it. Thank you. Thanks very much. So as I was writing this paper and thinking about it, as I said, I'm thinking specifically about the context of North American and European society, so-called Western society, in which I believe ageism is absolutely rampant. It would be a very interesting question for me to know if there are actually societies where there is no ageism, or whether it's simply the fact that ageism takes different forms in other societies that are not part of the dominant industrial complex of nations. Filial piety by itself, I guess I have reservations about that term, because I'm not sure that piety is really what I think would in any way dissolve ageism. I don't want to give the impression that ageism is simply a matter of attitudes. It is definitely a matter of institutions and social arrangements and the physical built apparatus that we have to live in, the social groupings that we find ourselves in. Certainly there would be possibilities for mitigating ageism in some ways, but I think filial piety by itself would not be enough.
Thanks so much. So the next one, Rua Williams asks, what are some opportunities for aging people to ally politically with disabled people that move us toward a more just culture of aging, without requiring us to valorize aging as somehow distinct from disability, which in effect uplifts aging people at the expense of disabled people?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. So I guess in some ways I would want So I'm not saying that aging is disability. I'm saying that ageism disables people. So I'm obviously, it's not the case that these two social categories completely overlap. So perhaps if we think of them as Venn diagrams, they overlap partially, but perhaps not completely. Opportunities for aging people to ally politically with disabled people. Well, I mean, I guess I think everybody should be allying with disabled people, not only aging people. And I also think that everybody should be allies for aging people, because the fact is, I think it's important to recognize that just as we all get old unless we die very early, we are all likely to experience various kinds of disability at various points in our lives, early, late, middle, and so on. That is, it's hard for me to think of these categories as constituting groups that are completely distinct from the rest of society. That's part of the mistake, I think, because the mistake is to assume that there is a norm. That norm is non-disabled, that norm is young. There isn't really, there isn't a norm except insofar as we insist on treating a certain image as being the norm. But in fact, I think the categories are much more fluid than that, and we go through all kinds of challenges and opportunities in our lives related to our physical and psychological and cognitive abilities that vary, I think, sometimes tremendously throughout our lives. So I guess, yeah, I think I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Thanks. So the next question from the chat, Ivan R. asks, are people who made possible this view of ageism Just trying to make sure I've got it correctly. Are people who made possible this view of ageism count on themselves being included in this harmful for older people category?
Oh, sorry, I can't see. Are people who made possible this view of ageism?
I think maybe are people who made possible this view of ageism, are they counting on themselves being included in this harmful for older? Oh, so are the people who sort of are invested maybe in this view of ageism counting on themselves as being included in this category? I think is the question.
Thank you for your question. I am not sure I understand it. This view, because I don't know whether by this view of ageism you mean the view that I'm putting forward, or the view that I am trying to analyze that I find in society. So,
Ivan, if you're there, would you be willing to post maybe a clarification of your question in the chat? Okay. Thanks.
Sorry, is it coming through?
So Ivan has responded, yes. Maybe just while we're waiting for the clarification of Ivan's question, I'll move on to Melinda's question, which is next.
Okay.
Because there's about, I think, 13 minutes left. So Melinda Hall asks, you mentioned that the double bind cannot necessarily be seen by the victim. So what would philosophical work that defamiliarizes the double bind look like?
So this is, thank you. This is something that's really striking to me. I'm actually somewhat persuaded that double binds may operate in terms of enforcing and expressing a lot of different forms of oppression, but that they are very difficult to see, and that is part of their effectiveness. So that it's not as if any one person or any one institution or organization comes along and says, you have this choice and you have this choice, and they're both bad for you, choose one. I think, I mean, I don't, so my own paper is an attempt to expose the nature of the double bind as it operates. And I believe that as people, I mean, I'm not sure what more to say other than what I've tried to model here, that that if we can bring into full view the two arms of the double bind, we are more likely to see how preposterous it is and how negating of the individual's personhood it is. So Melinda, I'm not sure what I can say that's helpful in response to your question, other than to urge people to look for the ways in which there may be double binds expressed with respect to race and gender and sexuality and class. So, I mean, I don't pretend to have any kind of expertise about any of those because I haven't thought far enough about it. But I am kind of convinced that this may be a very dominant form of messaging that is coming to people, and it's coming to people in the culture, and part of its success is its mystifying nature. Sorry, I can't say more about that.
There's a response from Melinda in the chat that it's helpful, so it's good. Okay, so Ivan has clarified a little bit more, and he just in respect to the sort of view, he says specifically a view from which you analyzed through your work, so ageism in negative context. So just as a reminder of his Do you need
Okay,
me?
so my view.
Okay, yeah.
Are people, okay, so are people, so seems to me that well, again, I guess I'm not, I'm sorry to hesitate. I'm just not really sure I understand this question. I think it's important for old people to be aware of the functioning of ageism, to not see it as benign, to not see the ways in which we are condescended to or counted out or omitted or have our autonomy compromised. We can't see that as benign or simply well-intentioned, but see it as an insidious way to make old people disappear, either physically or as persons. So I think it's really important for people to recognize the significance of the operation of ageism. But Ivan, I'm very sorry. I'm still not sure that I entirely understood your question.
If I might help clarify, I think what he's getting at is the younger members of society who might help advance this idea of ageism, are they themselves then thinking that when they're older, they'll fall into the category of those who are adversely affected by ageism? I think that might be what he's saying.
Okay, thank you, Katie. So let me just say, that's a good question. So it's important for, as I said earlier, for people to recognize that if they don't die, they're going to become old. That means they're going to become targets of ageism, whether they like it or not. But I do not personally believe that ageism is only ever directed at old people. I think there are particularly egregious forms of it, including the tendency, for example, to see everybody from, let's say, age 60 to 100, that's a 40-year span, as all being the same, as if we are all alike. But I believe that ageism is also targeted at other ages, and the most obvious example is, I think, children under the age of 10 or 12. And I think that that form of ageism is also harmful to children, that they are seen as not fitting the norm, as being educated and shaped in order to become the norm, as being urged to grow up so they can exemplify the norm. And they live in a built environment and in a social environment that is not always, or even in some cases ever, set up to actually suit their needs, abilities, and wants. So I guess I think that ageism is, it's a dominant phenomenon. It can take different forms, although interestingly, for both old people and for children, the notion that that one is not fully functioning, that one's mind isn't fully developed, that one's psychological skills are not necessarily good, that one's physical skills are inadequate. Maybe that's some of the things that ageism towards children and towards old people has in common. Thank you.
Thanks. So we've got 6 minutes. There's a question from Pushpa Parak who asks, is there a way to think of responding to ageism and ableism by examples of how the disabled aging persons negotiate or even challenge deficit social and cultural constructions of themselves? So what can resistance or even defiance of these norms look like? And if you're looking for that in the chat, it came in.
Okay, it's in the chat. Yes.
Yeah.
How do I think of? Well, I'll go with the last sentence in particular, the question, what can resistance or even defiance of these norms look like? It's hard for old people to do this because part of the expectations that are laid upon us are to be acquiescent, quiet, accepting, to accept the idea that their lives are pretty well over, that possibly they are a burden, which is not a view I accept at all, by the way. The best thing for individuals is for individuals to be able to speak up, but I don't underestimate just how difficult that is. Of course, it's difficult, and part of the challenge is to simply recognize what is being done to oneself, and I do think that there is more and more recognition of the pernicious effects of ageism on people than there was in the past. But socially and institutionally, we would need to think a lot more about how we structure society. I mean, this is always the case with dealing with oppression. Why do we have so many institutions, so many organizations, so many different ways of setting up society that segregate people by age? Why do we put old people in institutions and expect them to stay there and be out of the way? Why do we assume that education is primarily something for the beginning of life and not something for the end of life? Why do we assume that certain forms of active participation in society are appropriate at some stages of life and not at other stages of life? Why do we assume that active production of goods and services is the only way in which an individual acquires value? If you make that assumption, then both young people and old people are inadequate. You know, on the individual level, there are opportunities to push back. I can tell you from my own experience that can be difficult, and it doesn't always get a welcoming response. It actually sometimes just produces bafflement. But also, this is a matter of social change. So the kind of paper that I've written is, I guess, a typical, for me, philosophical paper is to just try to lay bare what I think of as some of the ideological functionings of aging. That's what I'm trying to do as a small contribution to mapping out the ways in which ageism disables. But it's a huge project to think about how to defy these norms. And yeah, I think I've been spending a long time on it and I don't have all the answers. Thank you for your question.
All right, so with 2 minutes left, we have a question from August Gorman, who asks, what are the opportunities and limits that you think that removing the stigma of relying on others in old age can play in removing this stigma in the broader disability community?
You think removing the stigma of relying on others. So I guess one point I would make, and this is an obvious one that is being made in many, many different contexts and schools of thought, is just to help people realize how much everyone relies on others. I think that, whoops, oh, the question disappeared. But I think that living in the pandemic has laid that bare if it was hard for people to recognize before. So if we see reliance on others as something that happens throughout life and that happens in different forms, like needing physical help, needing psychological help, needing help with cognitive input and intellectual input. That happens at all stages of our lives. So the notion that old people are uniquely burdensome not only fails to recognize the ways in which old people do contribute and do have value, but it fails to recognize the ways in which people are dependent on others at all stages of life. And simply recognizing that simple fact, the fact of interconnectedness, mutual dependence in a society that values the solitary, accomplished individual is a big task to attain, but one that I think is really important.
Super, thanks so much. In various ways, can we all sort of thank Christine overall for her talk and for the discussion, and thanks all of you for all of your questions.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Christine, so much, and Jane, thank you too. Just a very brief comment, Christine, as you were talking about the double bind, it made me think of the exact opposite, which are people who can do no wrong, whatever they do, and the type of extreme privilege that goes with it. So I feel the double bind is actually quite a good way of reinforcing the insider-outsider and the extreme insider of someone. I think Trump once boasted that even if he shot people on Fifth Avenue. So anyway, I just thought that was a nice contrast for you.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a wonderful thought. That is a really useful observation.